Everyone talks about curing cancer, but no one talks about the 90% of drugs that fail. Drug development. It's the costliest problem in medicine. Up to $5 billion lost per drug. Decades wasted. Lives cut short. And worse, we often don't even know why it failed.
We think we can do better by a lot.
The real revolution? It's not a drug. It's the algorithm behind the drug. Genialis doesn't make medicine, they make medicine make sense. By translating RNA into insight, they're making every treatment smarter, faster, and more human.
Every drug is going to have kind of an information companion that helps it on its journey.
And the man behind it, a scientist who once turned down a chef's job on a Mediterranean yacht because he believed a harder, lonelier road might just save more lives.
I actually think about that decision every day of my life.
But before we dive in, just one ask. If this episode shifts your thinking even just a little, follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone you respect. That's how we bring in more world-class minds and take these conversations even deeper. This isn't just an episode, it's an invitation to rewire how we build, test, and trust medicine. Rafael, good to see you. We were just talking about Houston, why Houston is so special. Why are 150 languages spoken in Houston? What's the reason?
Oh gosh, I'm probably going to give you an apocryphal answer, but the reason that I was told is that this is what the major port of entry for immigrants coming into the United States, especially under refugee status or asylum status or any other government-mediated relocation program. And of course, all of those sorts of things are in peril today, but historically speaking, this is where people would just land first. And often, there's already a community, you can stick around. I used to do volunteer work at one of the Houston refugee centers. This was in the kind of 20-teens, so 2011 to 2015. And there were a huge number of newly relocated Middle Eastern, South Asian refugees, that were displaced by the ongoing wars. And they would come here and there were already, communities, mosques, restaurants, things like this, and would often stay.
Houston is the first port of entry or the first point of entry for immigrants.
This is again, this could be complete nonsense. It's just what I had heard when I asked somebody. So when the U.S. government would relocate or was involved in the relocation of an immigrant, this is often the port they would come through. Don't take me at my word. Google it. I'm sure there's a real answer out there somewhere.
I will.
But it remains true that it's an incredibly diverse city, an incredibly plural city in a very functional way. Like in your everyday life, you run into people from all over the world. I would argue there might be another reason. The major industries here are oil and gas and medicine. And both oil and gas and medicine tend to be sort of ethnogeographically rather diverse, right? Oil and gas is a global industry, a global trade. And, medicine really doesn't know boundaries.
Well, why is medicine so famous in Houston? What's the main point that you would tell the audience?
Yeah, the Texas Medical Center in Houston is the world's largest contiguous medical center.
Wow.
I don't know how many institutions make it up today, but when I was a researcher there, again, 2011 to 2015, there were 69 or 70 partner institutions, shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. A good friend of mine came to visit for a weekend, and I took him to show him around the medical center, and he looks up, staring at these towering glass hospitals and research institutes, and he goes, "Man, this is like Las Vegas for hospitals," and it really is. So the Texas Medical Center is this extraordinary place, but of course, it had to start from somewhere. And Baylor College of Medicine was one of the anchor institutions. That's where I did my postdoctoral training. But there are some quite famous places like MD Anderson Cancer Center. It's
Mhm.
arguably the most famous cancer center in the world is there. It's quite famous for cardiology. DeBakey was a famous heart surgeon who invented most of what we think of as modern heart surgery. He was there. And in turn, world leaders, famous presidents and prime ministers and autocrats would come here for their life-saving therapies. And it really kind of put the place on the map.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that these famous centers are in Houston, Texas. It's always good to learn something new
Mhm.
while podcasting. And this is the reason why you relocated then to Houston and started your company there.
No, quite the contrary. I'm smart and I married well, and so my wife had, while I was playing at being an academic and then an early startup guy, she had a real job, has a real job. So she works for a big multinational energy company,
Mhm.
and so we moved to Houston for her work. We had been previously in the Bay Area, and before that, I was in the Northeast in the in New Haven, Connecticut, in the U.S. So I followed her kind of to California and then to Houston, following her work. But it turns out, if you're a scientist, Houston's a perfectly good place to land if you need to do science, because again, we have the world's largest medical center. So finding a really top quality lab to continue my postdoctoral work was not so hard.
You're blessed, basically. You lived in San Francisco in the Bay Area and then also
Hmm.
in Houston. When you look
Right.
at entrepreneurship and investing in both areas, what makes it
Hmm.
so special?
Yeah, well, the Bay Area has an unparalleled, ecosystem for entrepreneurship. In the life sciences, Boston, the general Boston area is okay, San Diego's okay, but the Bay Area has this incredible ecosystem is the right word because it needs at least two pieces. It needs both the novel technology and entrepreneurial spirit and deal flow, right? New companies, but it also needs investors. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem if you're trying to build a new startup hub. How do you attract investors if there aren't so many startups? And how do you get people to take a risk and build a startup if there's no way to fund it? And so, since I've been associated with Houston starting in 2011, and then when I began my entrepreneurial journey in 2015, I've witnessed the growth of an ecosystem from very much what was a cold start problem. You needed companies and you needed investors, and you needed to figure out how to grow them both at once. So Houston is now a much more competitive entrepreneurial ecosystem than it was 14, 15 years ago. Night and day different. But we still need more investors and we still need more startups. And so there's a bit of a pattern here where we can build really, really promising early stage companies. And again, we have all this access to the hospitals, to the medical center, top research, top innovation and IP, but we lack the community of seasoned operators. So when companies grow and they go to raise maybe their first big or second big institutional venture round, they very often move to the coasts, right? They'll go to Boston or they'll go to the West Coast seeking not only investment but more seasoned operators. Doesn't happen always. There's some great companies born here that are built here. But even Genialis is a bit like that. We started here in Houston. I went out to the Bay Area. I then actually traveled overseas, and now I'm back in Houston. And all the while, we've built our team where the talent was, rather than focusing on one geography.
That's a good thing. So you run basically a virtual company. It's not only located in Houston, Texas, but also in other cities.
So we have two offices with permanent seats. We have a commercial office in Boston, and then we have our larger office in Ljubljana, Slovenia. And Ljubljana is where my co-founder is from.
Mhm.
And I don't know how many desks exactly we have, but it's like a 25 person office, something like this. We're
Wow.
35 people globally. So it's the bulk of the workforce. So it is virtual in a sense. I'm remote to the team, but we very much have a physical presence, right? And
Mhm.
and we have a place for people to have the kind of synergies and the serendipity you get from sharing a workspace with others. But I myself don't get to take advantage of that very often, only when I travel overseas or up to Boston to be with the rest of the team.
Now I'm really tempted to ask one question.
Yeah,
You
sure.
have experienced San Francisco. You're familiar with Texas, also Boston, and the other
Hmm.
areas in the United States,
Right.
and Europe with
Yeah.
your co-founder in Slovenia. When you look at the
Hmm.
European ecosystem, what makes the European ecosystem special for you that you say it makes sense for your
Hmm.
company to stay in Europe and not pull everything over to the United States?
It's a great question. So we have a lot of Slovenian roots, first of all, the company does. The origin story is the Genialis was originally founded by three Slovenian colleagues, a data scientist, another IT guy who was really interested in sort of building a scalable company, and a third musketeer who I think of as sort of our swingman. He would do everything, anything that was needed. Really versatile guy. So that was Slovenia. I actually met these guys through the research, right? So I was a scientist at Baylor College of Medicine here in Houston. Um, my co-founder Micha Stajdahar, he's still our chief technology officer. He came over on what we could call kind of an industry postdoc, right? He had finished his PhD in AI. I was the biologist, he's the AI guy. And he wanted to start this company, and his professor, his PhD advisor, had an appointment at Baylor and said, well, take your technology, go to Baylor, and ask everyone in the hallways, what do they need you to do with the technology? What's the problem to solve, right? And so he and I did research together for a while in the lab. And then I ended up drinking the Kool-Aid, realizing that machine learning, artificial intelligence, and software that enabled us to use data with these tools, this was really the future of medicine, right? And so I fully drank the Kool-Aid. I joined the cult. And by way of doing that, I joined the executive team of the company as a fourth co-founder. So we had this Slovenian history, but why has it been special to us going forward? Here are some of the key things that we've gained from maintaining a serious footprint in Slovenia. The first of all is just access to phenomenal human beings. It's an incredibly wonderful group of people. And I don't want to paint an entire country with one brush, but everyone I meet there is gracious, humble, thoughtful, brilliant, and really kind of collaborative in nature, but also supremely talented, right? So it's an incredibly strong science, technology, engineering, and math oriented education in Slovenia. In fact, a lot of what we think of today as modern machine learning has its roots in that part of the world. So there's even a long tradition and history of developing these technologies. And I would argue that two of the top five most important academic scientists applying AI to biomedicine today are both from Slovenia. And I've had the privilege of working closely with one, and the other came from the same program as my co-founder. So it's got this great source of talent. And then there's another characteristic of the ecosystem there that I think is advantageous, for example, against Silicon Valley or maybe even Boston, rather than having to retrain new talent every year because someone's bouncing to the next shiny thing. We have a deeply committed, deeply loyal workforce with a lot of longevity. We've got bunches of employees who've been with the company as long as I have for the whole decade I've been working there. We have deep institutional knowledge. We punch above our weight because people work so well together. And we can avoid the costs of having to rehire and retrain constantly with this dedicated workforce. So I think a combination of the talent and the loyalty and just the goodness of the people has given us a real advantage.
That's good to hear, and let's that sink in for our Europeans. We have smart people in Europe that makes
No
US
doubt.
CEOs say, let's stay in Europe and not pull everything over to the US.
Yeah, so I mean, we're structured. I don't think it's so unusual now. I think in the world past COVID, people realize that geography is not looked at as a barrier, but just something to work with. And so, we have our company is registered as a Delaware C corporation, right? This is Genialis Inc. It's structured in as sort of a sensible and plain vanilla way as possible. We've got a board of directors, et cetera, but we own a subsidiary in Slovenia, and through that subsidiary, we can hire a Slovenian workforce, and then we can also employ a U.S. and ex-US, ex-Slovenia international workforce through the US based entity. And it's when we talk to investors, when we talk to strategic partners, the structure makes total sense. It's not so atypical.
Oh, that's good to hear. We are now 15 minutes in our conversation, and I know that part of the audience will jump off after 15 minutes and come back later to watch the episode. When we
Okay.
think about this part of the audience who say, okay, I've seen the start, and now I make to want my decision
Mm.
whether I come back or not. What's the one message that you would give this audience that makes them come back?
Why should they come back?
Mm,
Hmm. Well, depends on why they're here. But I think that the thing that's going to be most impactful to take away from the whole conversation is how precision medicine is changing, because we are now at this point where we have both data in life sciences that are approaching big data, whereas before it was all small data. And we now have the AI algorithms reaching maturity and an understanding of how to deploy them in ways that are truly going to change the face of medicine.
that's a good message. When we think about your company, Genialis, or is it Genialis? Genialis.
hmm In
Genialis.
the US, it's the soft G, and Slovenia, it's the hard G. So you choose. I say
Oh, so you
Genialis.
have,
My co-founder says
both.
Genialis.
That's cool. That's cool. I'm from Austria, so basically north of Slovenia.
Sure.
What's the big idea behind your company?
Yeah. So the big idea is that all disease, but we focus on cancer. Cancer in general is not one disease, right? In fact, it's not even 30 diseases based on the tissue. It's every patient's disease is unique to that patient. And we now have the tools to understand the uniqueness, to understand the individuality of the disease. And to not only understand that, but then to say, okay, we can predict what's the best possible therapeutic intervention based on the uniqueness of this disease. And so the idea behind our company is to make these tools highly scalable, highly accessible, accurate, informative. We want all of medicine to be precision medicine. And again, we're starting with cancer, with oncology. And I think we're blazing a path that a lot of others will be able to follow in terms of how to make decision making around everything from developing new drugs to diagnosing and prescribing new medicines in the clinic, a much more data-driven activity rather than just following the book or following one's gut.
What's the toughest problem you're currently working on with your team?
Hmm. I think the toughest thing about building any startup is, frankly, it's the business side of it rather than necessarily the product or technology. We've been astonished in some ways by how well the products work, how well the technology is working. It wasn't easy. We've been beating at this for over a decade, 15 years if you go back to the R&D in the lab. So it's not an overnight success, but the challenge is really shifting buying decisions, shifting paradigms at the layer of, well, how do you get a doctor to prescribe a new test? First of all, you have to educate them. They have to even know the test is available. But how do you change, physician behavior? How do you change, patient reticence to join a clinical trial? So these kinds of kind of ingrained behaviors, and in the US, you have systematic challenges with healthcare. How do you get easier paths to reimbursement for important tests, right? These big kind of systemic behavioral or market challenges, I think, are the hardest to crack. And the good news is we don't have to fix that alone, right?
Mhm.
We have a unique set of tools, we have a unique set of products and a unique selling proposition. But this need to change behaviors and to change uh, buying patterns and to change government or economic policies is something that the whole industry is pushing towards.
It's good to know when you look at both sides, tech and business, when is the right point for a scientific breakthrough that the team starts thinking about the business side?
In an ideal world, if I were going to, do my next startup or another startup, you would have the problem that you want to solve figured out well before you have the technology to solve it, right? So in a way, you're already proving out the business need by selling solutions before they're built. And sure, to an extent, we've done that, but we've also absolutely been guilty of this idea of, well, we built this really cool tech, we've got this awesome software, this awesome algorithm. Let's go see if anyone wants it, right? And you really do need to do the market validation first. So I would argue that the business in some ways needs to lead. But it's always a bit of a seahorse, or a seesaw rather, seahorse, seesaw going back and forth, right? It's always a bit of a you know, you first feel a need, and in this case, Genialis was born of the needs that I personally felt in the lab. I needed software, I needed better tools to predict experimental outcomes, right? So we built some of that, and then we went and sold some of that, and we iterate with the customers, and it has not been a direct, like straight as an arrow line from here's our vision 10 years ago, here we are today. It's been much more of a windy road than that.
When did you decide to turn the technical idea into a business?
Well, again, this was, I had the good fortune of kind of stepping into something that was already partly baked, right? So my co-founders, I think, had the passion to be businessmen, right? I had a passion to keep doing science, but not as an academic laboratory scientist because I didn't think I'd be very good at that. So my desire was less around building the business and more around showcasing new capabilities of the technology, right? And in that way, when I joined the company, I was actually the chief product officer, not the chief executive officer. So I had a bit of a commercial mandate. I had to build something that people wanted to buy. Um, but I would argue that my strength wasn't so much in the business as in daydreaming, like how the product should work, how it should look and feel. Um, Growing into this idea of we've really got to have a business-led, product roadmap is something that I've had to learn through mistakes, and I think we're quite good at now. We have a pretty simple thesis. So let me fast forward. Today, Genialis's products, what we sell to the market, are AI algorithms that help predict all sorts of things about a patient's response to drug. So base case, it's a diagnostic algorithm that tells you whether or not a drug is going to work for a given patient. But it does a lot more than that. It helps pharmaceutical companies developing new medicines to figure out how is our drug working? Why is it failing? For whom does it work? For whom does it fail? What are some other strategies? Should we be combining it with other drugs? Should we be using different medicines entirely? So all of these questions they have around the translational and clinical development of new medicines. And we also work with big diagnostics companies when we have a more mature algorithm to wrap that into an actual clinical test that doctors can order to inform their treatment decisions. Those two pieces of the business. Okay, so what algorithm should we build, right? As my CEO or my CTO, my co-founder told me early on, I can model anything, but you have to ask a good question first, right? So we have to ask ourselves if we're going to build an algorithm and try to work with pharma on drug development or work with a diagnostics company to get it to market, what algorithm to build. And so we do have a pretty straightforward commercial thesis for that. What targets, what genetic molecular targets are a lot of drug companies chasing after because we think they're going to be efficacious, and therefore the competitive landscape of clinical development is quite big. And which drugs are likely, even once approved, to only work for a subset of patients, and therefore they need an algorithm to guide them to the right patients. So these are the two questions we ask. What are the hot drug development areas? And maybe it's what are the ones that are going to be hot in a couple of years, right? Because you always want to meet the market where it's going, not where it is today. And then the other question is, where do patients really need better tools? And therefore, we think doctors will use them. And very often, it's the answer is the same thing. So drugs like immune checkpoint inhibitors are really very much aided by the presence of good biomarkers, although we need better ones. Drugs like KRAS inhibitors, the RAS family of proteins is responsible for almost a quarter of all cancers. It's the oldest known oncogene. We've known about it for over 40 years, but we only have 2 approved drugs, and those are recent approvals. It's a hyper-competitive market to have the next approved KRAS therapy and to do better than the ones that got there first. So we think we can impact that marketplace because we've built, in my opinion, the best and the only commercially available algorithm that can tell you exactly how your patients are going to react to a RAS inhibitor, for how long are they going to benefit, if they're not going to benefit, what you should do instead. So we try to identify these competitive drug development situations. It's a bit of a spoiler alert, but we've shared our roadmap publicly. We're also working in the DNA damage response space. There are lots of important drug targets there. And again, the drugs work for some of the people, but not all the time. We're really interested in antibody drug conjugates. It's a new therapeutic modality. There are some approved drugs. Again, they work great for some patients, but not all, and we don't know why. We think we can build algorithms that explain all of this and really help bring better medicines to patients. But it's now driven largely by, what we think the market will succeed in the market.
That's good to know and an amazing development. When you look at your work in the cancer area in the last 10 years, what's the most surprising insight that you gained?
Oh gosh. The most surprising insight from the last 10 years. I think that a key part of my philosophy of leadership and of company building is this idea that if you build a great company, in other words, a place people really want to work, that's full of amazing human beings, that, multidisciplinary, talented, that share values but don't share worldviews, right? Those are two different things. People who come with very different perspectives but aggregate around shared values. If you can build a company like that, then a great business will follow. And that's not always obvious. In fact, I would argue that's quite contrarian to the mercenary approach to building a startup where it's got to be super lean, only 10x employees working 16-hour days, hustle, hustle, hustle. Building a company where the culture is the first thing you work on has worked really well for us. And that wasn't obvious in the beginning.
How would you describe the culture at your company?
But I describe the culture in the terms of the core values that we each we each promote, that we each try to live every day. And not everyone in the company relates to each of the 5 values equally, but we all relate to at least one, and we all know all 5. And so they are people first. That's our North Star, right? Putting people first, putting ourselves first, even sometimes as an example of how to put humans ahead of the non-human. Honesty, ownership, constructiveness, and innovation. And each one of these, when we pick a value, or when we think about how to distill down what we believe into a value, it has to be something that you could argue the opposite with a straight face. So no one's going to say, "Oh, don't put people first." Well, not necessarily. Some people might have an innovation of hustle, or a value of hustle. Instead of innovation, people might say, something like, be the least expensive, right? That's not innovative, that's commoditized. So there are ways of taking the opposite position on each of our values. So we've chosen them very deliberately to aggregate into a culture where, I guess if I had to sum it up, I think everyone in our company, everyone on our team tries as hard as we do, works as hard as we do, uh, you know, pushes for success because we're doing it for one another, right? We're not we're not in it for ourselves, we're in it for the collective. And so I think that's probably the way that I feel the culture most.
That's an amazing answer. I think the most of the companies that I experience in deep tech areas or biotech areas, they talk very often about the technology, of course, uh,
Mhm.
that they need money and cash flows to keep growing and keep moving the business forward. But very rarely I do get a conversation about culture and values and beliefs in companies.
Mhm.
Why is this so important for you that you focus on culture and values?
It's important for a few reasons, but mainly it's what we do is hard. What we do takes time. It takes patience. And as I mentioned, it's not going to be a straight line. Maybe a better way to think of it is not always going to be up. It's going to be up and down. And so I think that focusing on culture, first of all, it makes going to work every day a joy, right? You genuinely look forward to both the ability to do interesting, meaningful work that's mission oriented, but to do it with people you enjoy doing it with. So that's step one. It just makes, it makes the 9 to 5 a lot more fun. And then the other part is it makes us a lot more resilient, right? So we're resilient to setbacks, we're resilient to adversity. And, Lord knows in the biotech industry, these last 4 years, really since the market burst at the end of 21, has been really hard for a lot of companies working in the life sciences space. We've been hyper resilient and we punch way above our weight. The sophistication of our technology and our products, the novelty of our products, the ability to solve really hard problems that a lot of people have tried and failed at solving is something that a company our size probably has no business being the best at. But somehow we find a way to really punch above our weight. And again, I think that all comes from the culture.
That's good to know. Let's switch a little bit to your company and to your area, your research area that you tackle with your company. When you look at cancer biology today, what's your understanding in the company about how cancer behaves?
Wow, that's a really great question. And it's interesting. There have been a number of thought piece papers recently that attempt to rethink the way that we understand cancer. I think the most important thing is that cancer is not one thing, it's not monolithic, right? So historically, cancers have been diagnosed and treated based largely on the part of the body in which they're detected, right? And in a way, this makes sense because surgical removal of the tumor, cutting it out, is still our best treatment, right? It's the thing that works if you can get it all. And surgery is done by people who are specialized in the anatomical region at which they surgery, which they cut. So that, okay, it makes sense in a historical context. But what we're learning is that, and what we can appreciate now is cancer is really a disease of molecules, of misregulation of the genetic code through its uh, the way the genetic code is realized through genetic signaling and the RNA, and how it manifests as the molecular and cellular phenotype through proteins, metabolites, and ultimately cells. I think it's perfectly valid for scientists to focus on any one of those kind of layers of abstraction, right? So if you think of a disease model as being an onion, right? You can think of it as the core of nucleus and what's going on in the DNA is the most important. You can go out layers and you can come all the way out to heck, there are companies that think about defining cancer based on molecules that sit on the surface of the cell, right? All of those are valid. The trend we're seeing, though, especially given our ability to measure things and to use AI to analyze them, is really to think of it as an integration of all of those layers, right? So to have come up with a multimodality model of cancer. Now, my company has specialized at one of those layers. I would argue we're about the best in the world at understanding the RNA expression layer of cancer. So figuring out how gene expression can be used to paint a picture of the tumor biology, which is informed by the genetic information, which shows up in the RNA, and is translated to informs the phenotypic layer. So we like RNA as an input analyte. We think it's clinically robust. We think it's highly informative. It's cost effective. But we recognize there are a lot of good things one could measure and should measure. And so the models that we're building are growing in sophistication in terms of the different layers that inform the models. And what one chooses to actually measure in the clinic, I think, depends a lot on the condition of the patient and what's accessible and what's affordable, so long as the underlying representation of the disease is sufficiently well informed, it should work.
How can I imagine your solution? When do you come in?
Yeah, so with most pharma customers, pharma collaborators, we start pretty early. One of the things that makes our approach to building AI models a bit unique is that we are training the model to understand underlying cancer biology. So I want to paint a contrast. The alternative to understanding underlying cancer biology is to say, we've got 1,000 patients who've all been treated with a drug and 300 of them did well, and we're going to ask a computer to figure out what those 300 have in common, right? So that's training on outcomes. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. It's how a lot of machine learning works. But we've built a big model. It's an AI foundation model. We call it the Genial supermodel that has learned fundamental cancer biology. And what this allows us to do is to configure products, patient classifier algorithms, translational intelligence algorithms before a drug has ever even been in people. So we start with a lot of pharma companies and we develop these models for their drug. And we can say, well, how do we know if it's working? Well, when you run your organoid studies, your cell line studies, your mouse studies, we can validate the model. And then when you take your drug into humans, we can do a retrospective analysis on those first in human data and show you the model translates to human biology. It works in the human context. We can retrain the model on human data to make it compound specific, to give our customers a competitive advantage because their drug is now differentiated by this algorithm that can serve as a clinical biomarker, and then go all the way to helping build a diagnostic device if that's in our partner's roadmap. But we can start quite early. Now, more and more, we're partnering with diagnostics companies as well. And here again, it's a question of aligning the business roadmap. What is the test that we want to put on market? We can configure that algorithm rather quickly and work with our partners to do the relevant validations, the analytical validation, the clinical validation that you need to build a regulated device. And then our diagnostic partners will do the work to actually build the test, and we can share in whatever commercial success there may be. So we have both business models. With pharma, we start quite early in the drug development process. And with diagnostics companies, again, it's mostly going to be a market-driven question.
So you start basically with pharma early also in the preclinical phase or lead optimization phase.
Yeah, I mean, we can jump in anywhere, but typically, if you're already in late clinical stage, you've got your roadmap figured out. So a typical starting point for us would be a drug that's either just pre-IND
Mm.
or maybe even in phase 1, first in humans, but where we'll do the initial validations on the translational models and then jump into humans. We can start anywhere, but again, it depends a bit on what the pharma company is looking to get out of it. We've also done a lot of work, frankly, this retrospective analyses of later stage trials that either didn't work as well as they were hoping or need to be modified, or maybe we're looking to say, well, this was successful. What's the next disease we should go to? Our models are informed by so much biology, right? These classifier algorithms we're building have learned a lot of biology. They're quite useful at all sorts of question and answer type activities. So wanting to better understand the mechanism of the drug or maybe why it fails sometimes, wanting to understand what a combination strategy would be for patients who need, two medicines to benefit. We have a publication coming out at ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, later this year in June, where we look longitudinally at patients who go on a drug. We can predict exactly how long the drug's going to work, and when it stops working, we can suggest what they should take next, right? So developing tools that allow this kind of insight into the patient journey is really, I think, quite unique and transformative.
That's good to hear. It's amazing the work you're doing. You mentioned a few, let me call it buzzwords, and I would like to dive deeper into
Mhm.
those words. for me to understand them better. You mentioned patient classifiers. Can you explain to
Mhm.
me what they are and how they flip the biomarker
Yeah,
game?
that's a great question. So we struggle a little bit to figure out what's the right word to name our product. What are we selling? And for the last couple of years, we've been pushing on this idea of, all right, let's just call them biomarkers. But the problem is that the word biomarker has a lot of existing meanings, right? It's a well-established term of art. And a biomarker could honestly be almost anything. When you go to your doctor for an annual checkup and they do your blood pressure, that's a biomarker, right? When when they take a blood draw and they measure cholesterol, that's a biomarker, right? Like all of these things are biomarkers. And in cancer drug development, historically speaking, a biomarker is either thought of as the genetic mutation that we think is causing the cancer. So, for example, you have a G12C mutation in your KRAS gene. That is your biomarker, which indicates that you get a G12C selective KRAS inhibitor. Makes total sense. It just doesn't do a very good job of predicting whether the medicine's going to work or not. Or maybe you have overexpression of the uh, immune checkpoint inhibitor target PD-L1, right? So it's the cell surface protein, and you have too much of it. That indicates that you should get a checkpoint inhibitor. Again, it makes a lot of sense. You're measuring the amount of target, but it doesn't do a very good job of telling you whether or not a patient's going to benefit, right? In fact, 2/3 of 60% of patients who get immune checkpoint inhibitors get sicker, not better, but they still spend $250,000 a year for that the right to get the medicine. We can do a lot better. So we are building biomarker models, but it's a different kind of biomarker, a biomarker reimagined. It's reimagined because it measures the entire transcriptome of the tumor, all of the data available about both the genetics and the phenotype. And then we distill that through our AI models into a subset of informative biological modules. And those we use to develop machine learning classifiers that say the patient is going to be drug responsive, non-responsive, or sometimes there are more categories. It could be responsive to the monotherapy, responsive to the combo. It just depends. We can tweak that. So what are the patient predictors? What are the patient classifiers? Again, they're AI models that put a patient into a biomarker bin, but they're much more sophisticated than what we think of as a traditional biomarker.
So it's not just one variable, it's a sum of many variables, and you match the
That's
patient
right.
with the right drug.
Mhm. These are ensemble models, and the input features to the input to a given patient classifier is a subset of biological attributes that our foundation model has determined and scored based on the whole transcriptome.
But isn't that not only useful for clinical trials, but also for patients, for real patients outside clinical
Mhm.
trials when they are looking for a
Yes.
therapy?
We think it will be. So we as a company have not gone so far as to get a test into the hands of doctors yet, and that's a huge goal of ours. We have some major partnerships, including one we announced at JP Morgan earlier this year, for example, with Tempus AI. We have done work with a number of other large global diagnostics firms, and the whole goal is to take our skill, our acumen at building these algorithms, and partner with a group that has the platform, the distribution, and the resources to get the algorithms into the clinic. Um, we're hoping to have have doctors ordering tests based on Genius algorithms potentially as early as next year, but stay tuned.
This would be great. Would be great.
Mhm.
So we're basically moving away in the industry from the one drug fits all in
Yeah.
cancer. We don't want to have the wonder weapon or the Wunderwaffe that basically eliminates all cancerous cells in all
Hmm.
patients. We are moving much more in a direction where we want to be precise and say, okay, this drug works with that patient and
Hmm.
that drug with this patient. We
Yeah.
are now streaming on live stream, and I can imagine that some conspiracy theorists come up with the idea and say, did you hear what pharma is doing now? They just select the patients of whom they know it will work in that clinical trial, and then they get it approved, and then they give it to everybody. Why is precision medicine much better for patients than
Hmm.
this Wunderwaffe approach, where we just try to eliminate everything?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, to be fair, the inclusion of a biomarker as a selection criteria in a clinical trial will impact initially the label of that drug, right? So you can't just say, well, for the clinical trial, we're going to restrict it to this subset, and then we give it to everyone. It doesn't actually work that way. But with that said, the biggest and arguably most groundbreaking cancer drugs like checkpoint inhibitors, were able to be so successful because initially we did in fact use biomarkers to help figure out what are the right diseases, what are the right subsets of patients. And the biomarkers have gotten more sophisticated, where we now have what we would think of as, tissue agnostic or pan-tumor biomarkers that measure the molecular biology, but it doesn't matter if it's, skin cancer, stomach cancer, whatever, as long as you've got the indicative biomarker, you can get the drug. And that's a huge shift, taking this idea that we talked about earlier of thinking of cancer really as a molecular and phenotypic disease, and using that information to direct therapy. The conspiracy theorists can go back to Twitter. They can leave our live cast if they want, and go home. But I do think that the idea of why is precision medicine better? It's because it's where all the stakeholders can come around and agree to something, right? Drug companies want to have obviously the biggest market for their medicines, but they also want to help patients. The longer a patient can stay on a drug, if we can make cancer a treatable chronic condition, right? By finding the right medicine for that patient's going to stay on that medicine until, the rest of their life. That's good business, right? You can create a much bigger, more durable market for yourself if the drug works. Furthermore, for drug companies, getting to market fastest, which means avoiding clinical trial failure, and or having the best drug on market, so being first or being best in any therapeutic class, means the difference between earning about 75% of all the revenue for that drug area versus fighting over the scraps with everyone who comes next, second, third, fourth, fifth, right? So there's a real economic incentive as well for drug companies to run smarter trials, to get to market faster, to find the right patient groups. Now, of course, diagnostics companies want to have better tests, right? It's a competitive business. You want to have the best possible tests. And doctors and patients want the best possible outcomes. So I think there's true alignment. And for that matter, hospitals and payers, right? Insurance companies, national healthcare systems want better outcomes, right? You don't want to spend $1 million a year on a drug if it doesn't work. So I think that the entire industry can agree that having better biomarkers that are accurate, that are highly informative, is a good goal. One thing that I think makes the Genialis approach different from some other approaches in a really valuable way, I'm not interested in giving a doctor a biomarker that says, yes, the patient should get drug A, or no, that patient is completely out of luck. I want to give them a biomarker that says, yes, the patient should get drug A, or yes, the patient should get drug A, but also with drug B, or no, the patient should not get either A or B, they should get C plus D. In other words, I would rather give doctors the information they need to find the right medicine rather than just a yes/no answer that leaves patients lacking options. And so this is part of why it's so important to take this approach where our underlying models have learned so much of the cancer biology that they can truly direct therapeutic decision making rather than simply acting as a barrier or a gate to getting treatment.
Why do you call your AI model the supermodel?
Oh, because I'm terrible at marketing. Um, so some years ago, I think it was in like end of 2020 or early 21, we were working on a pharma collaboration where we had developed a really great predictive algorithm that was built of about 100 genes. 50 of the genes represented the immune biology of the tumor microenvironment. The other 50 represented what we call the angiogenic biology of the tumor microenvironment, so the vascular system. And these two biologies, the immune biology, the angiogenic biology, are known to antagonize one another, and are both important in terms of a tumor's receptivity to various kinds of therapies. And in fact, very important drug targets sit in the immune compartment of the stroma or the vascular compartment. So checkpoint inhibitors, anti-angiogenics like Avastin, so forth, Keytruda, Avastin, big drugs. So we wanted to have a different way of modeling the interactions in this biology in a way that would let us, again, predict a whole continuum of therapeutic response and figure out the right medicines. And so once we were successful at this, I was thinking about it. Well, we had two biologies here. And according to Doug Hanahan, who's an American oncologist working in Switzerland, according to his last paper, there are 14 key biologies, and we've done two of them. So what if we did the other 12? And now we've got a library of 14 modeled biologies that we can mix and match for any particular cancer, any particular drug. This was the idea, and I sketched this on the back of a sheet of paper on my notepad to show it to my co-founder, my CTO, and ask him, could we build this? And it was one of those things. It was like, it's like a model, but it'd be more like a supermodel because it was just a name that we threw out. But you got to call it something. So,
If you would to have to name it again, what would your first choice be this time?
well, now that I see how well it works, I would absolutely call it the Genial supermodel.
Mhm.
Right? So the supermodel, it's incredibly satisfying to see something that was just kind of a fever dream some years ago come to life, but it's really, really cool. Since we announced the existence of this foundation model back in October of last year at Biotech X in Basel, and have started putting it into commercial practice with some of our pharma partners, we are able to build these patient classifiers 15, 20 times faster than we could before.
Wow.
And every time we build one, it gets better, smarter, faster. It's a true flywheel, right? So a flywheel implies this feed forward network effect that every time you turn the pedal on your bike, it goes faster. You turn the pedal on your bike. And like a bicycle, we really have two gears here. We've got one gear that's around recognizing new data and placing that data in the landscape of cancer biology. And every time we see a new data point, whether it's one patient, a cohort of patients, or whatever, that piece of the model gets smarter. And then it ended up not being 14 hallmarks. We've now validated about 150 signatures that represent the hallmarks. Every time we validate a model, the signatures that make up that model, the modules become more confident, become smarter. And so we've got these two cogs that really let us run fast. And again, every time we build one, we go faster still. So I would call it the supermodel again, although, I'd be happy to take in the comments, anyone who wants to help us with a naming prize. We can,
Maybe some marketing pro
yeah,
could come up with some ideas, and then you can choose and select
yeah,
one. But supermodel is basically it sticks. I think it's simple, it's easy, and it sticks. It's a great choice.
yeah.
When we think about cancer, I think the treatment of cancer has evolved in the last years, but it doesn't feel to me that we have already cracked everything in cancer and that people just pop a pill and say, okay, I have cancer, but
Mhm,
no worries, I live another 40 years and it's no problem at all. There is still a lot of, let's say, cancer treatments going wrong and the patient dies
mhm,
after 6, 12 months and it doesn't happen. It doesn't work well.
mhm,
What's the big problem that's still not cracked? What's your
mhm.
opinion about it? What can we do?
Yeah, so there are kind of two pieces here. The the thing that we know works best is not getting sick at all, right? So part of the reason why the incidence of cancer, at least in the US and some other places, have gone down on average, is that there are fewer people smoking cigarettes today. We had, massive environmental protection laws put in place from the 1970s that started reducing environmental causes of cancer, cleaner air, et cetera, right? I think there's also in the zeitgeist this idea of trying to eat and exercise, and so leading a clean life, trying to live healthy, trying to avoid cancer in the first place is still your best bet. The next thing that works best is early detection. And here's an area where there's been some really amazing technological improvements. There's a huge amount of technological promise that's yet to be realized, but I think we will. But the more tools we have to detect cancer early, the better. Because if you can catch it early, again, you can either kill it with chemo or you can cut it out and it doesn't spread and you can live a healthy life in remission. You- On the side where you need, kind of new drugs, new medicines, that doesn't necessarily mean that patients can be very sick by the time they get them, but certainly in clinical trials, that's usually the case, right? New medicines are tested in the toughest proving ground you could imagine, which are very sick patients who've already had a lot of different medicines that haven't worked or have worked and then stopped working. And, it's just a tall order. You know, Human biology is so unbelievably complicated. I once went to a seminar by a physicist who said, I quit doing astrophysics because it was too easy. I decided to do biology instead. It was way harder, right? It's so complicated, and there are so many different ways to think about why. It's knowing the right target, finding a molecule, whether it's a small molecule piece of chemistry or a biologic molecule like an antibody or an oligonucleotide, finding the right one that is going to inhibit the target, assuming you have the right target. And then there's the delivery challenge. How do you get it to the right place at the right time? This is part of why Genialis is so excited about antibody drug conjugates as a new therapeutic modality. This is very much like, it's precision medicine in the sense that it's a guided molecule. The molecule has a target finder, right? It's got an antibody that's looking for a marker that sits on the surface predominantly of cancer cells. It said this is a tumor. And in that way, we hopefully can kill the cancer without killing the nearby healthy cells. And attached to this by a linker is a poison. It's a warhead. It's a chemotherapy or some other therapeutic modality. And so this is an example, but just one example of a new kind of therapy we have in our armament, where we're really trying to target the cancer in a smarter way and deliver the right kind of drug to that cancer cell specifically. And this is, again, it's new. I think these things are going to work really well, but it's not just a question of needing to improve on the drug itself. We need the tools to know who to give them to, right?
Mhm.
And so again, back to what we do and why we do it, we think we've got a system that will give us much more reliable answers about who should get which medicines, considering that some people are just going to get sick and they're going to need medicines.
Yeah, still, but I like your approach that you mentioned environmental reasons, for example, not smoking, not drinking alcohol. It was
Mhm.
completely different 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I think the lifestyle here in Europe was more drink, smoke, do whatever you want, and when you are
Yeah.
sick, you can go to the doctor and then he helps you,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is a good improvement. The second part that you mentioned is improvement in diagnostics, early
Yeah,
detection.
especially early detection diagnostics.
So we should go regularly to the doctor for a checkup.
Yes, but even then, I mean, if you think about your wellness, so I'm 45 and I just went to have my annual physical a couple months ago. And sure, he does the blood work, he does this, pokes at some things. Um, but frankly, there's not a single test he's doing that looks for cancer. I had to ask. I raised my hand and said, I'm 45, and the guidelines say I should have a colonoscopy this year, right? A regular screening colonoscopy. And at least in the US, the standard is if it's clean, right? If they don't detect anything, then you have 7 to 10 years that you don't have to do it again, and then you come back. So I recommend that everyone, you should be aware of your age-related, diagnostics that you should get. But what I'm excited about are technologies like Grail's test, which has had some success and some challenges. But the idea that you could have a blood draw, and from that regular blood work, you could detect a large number of potential early stage cancers that maybe not even a definitive test, but it would be one that says, okay, you should go have a CT scan or an MRI, or you should get an X-ray of this particular part of your body because we detect a signal. And so I think the early detection molecular tests are going to be truly transformative once they're more routine.
How can you imagine that? Is it really enough to get a blood drop for early detection?
For some cancers. I think there was a bit of a naive hope, or maybe just a real a moonshot ambition that we could detect all cancers from one blood draw. And nothing's that easy, right? But the teams have done a lot of work, and we've invested a lot of money, we collectively as an industry, in figuring out what can we detect from sort of the minimally invasive tests possible. And it's not done, it's not solved, but I think those technologies are also really exciting.
How far? I mean, my ideal world would be I have an Apple Watch, I have an iPhone.
Hmm.
I sit in front of a computer to
Hmm.
just get 24/7 monitored
Hmm.
with the gadget that I use and get a
Right.
signal when something goes wrong in my body. Will this ever be a reality or is it science fiction?
I think for most cancers, it's probably science fiction. I think for some other diseases, it's quite possible, right? So uh, digital diagnostics are really, really neat, especially with things like neurodegenerative disease, even with things like depression um, and certain emotional diseases. The voice recognition tools on your phone already can detect all sorts of cool, things that you wouldn't necessarily think could be detected just by having this device. Wearable wearables, I think, could have obvious roles to play in things like cardiovascular disease and other diseases where these kind of systems level biomarkers, right? The biomarkers of your pulse, of your blood, of your pulse ox at the skin matter. I think for oncology, for better or for worse, we need deeper sampling. That's my guess. But again, we don't expect one drug to cure all the diseases. It may not be that one diagnostics
Mm,
test cures all the diseases, right? You could imagine a urine-based diagnostic built into your toilet that helps detect, urinary and gynecological cancers, or other reproductive cancers. You can imagine one built into your stool test for gastrointestinal
mm,
cancers, right? There are already great tests by, companies like Exact Sciences and Guardant have tests for, early colorectal detection from feces. Uh, so it's probably not going to be a one size fit all, but you could imagine, you know, any analyte that you can get from the body, whether it's saliva, lung aspirate, even just from our exhale, uh, blood, urine, feces, etc. These could all be used as a suite of kind of devices in, say, a modern bathroom to detect cancer. But
yeah.
maybe.
We started off with the business perspective on your company, and I
Mm-hmm.
think from the business side, to make it as convenient as possible for the patient and customers, the
Mm-hmm.
suggestions that you made, build it into normal life, for example, the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Why not? This would be an amazing way forward. You get
Mm-hmm.
diagnostics where you go and don't need to invest any time for a doctor check-in unless you have
Right.
something serious.
Yeah, and there are companies working on this. We, as a company, landed sort of in the space we are. Again, part of it was recognizing that people are still going to get sick and still need medicines, and that developing new medicines is a major industry that has gross inefficiencies, both in terms of the success rate and the amount of capital spent. That's just for drug development. And then medicine as an industry of treating patients has even larger gross inefficiencies in terms of giving people medicines that don't work and not actually having the efficacy that we want. And so we are tackling something, again, that has a huge ethical cost and a huge financial cost. I think we need kind of an all of the above solution space.
Yes.
If our company one day goes out of business, I hope the reason is because we're so good at detecting cancer early that we no longer need medicines for it. But until that day, we're going to
Mm.
try to help patients, find the treatments they need.
Yeah, drug development is a long process. It's
Yeah.
expensive and it's really, really expensive. The last number that I read is 5 billion. What do you think? What change can your solution bring to the industry in terms of cost and drug development speed?
Yeah, so just to share some numbers with listeners, and these numbers are sort of widely cited and could be disputed, but plus or minus, the clinical trial failure rate across all trial stages in oncology. So from the moment a medicine or a drug candidate enters trials to getting on market, the success rate is less than 10%, which implies the failure rate is over 90% aggregate. That's quite high. Fewer than 10%. It may even be fewer than 5% of new potential cancer molecules become medicines. And by the time you get to the clinic, there's typically $1 billion or more spent on development. It can cost another $1 billion or more to get through all the phases of clinical trials. So, imagine you get a medicine all the way to a big phase 3 clinical trial, and then you have a surprise failure. That's a very expensive failure. That's 15 years of work, maybe more. 2 billion, $2.5 billion of development costs, maybe more. And all the human lives of patients who are counting on that and enrolled in the clinical trial because they needed something, right? So the costs are real. We think that we can decrease the risk of failure in trials by a lot. There have been papers, both empirical and theoretical, that show that even the old kind of biomarkers, the simple kinds that I argued at the beginning are not the ones we should be focused on. Those can improve clinical trial success rates 5 to 12 times in the top 5 cancers. So you're 5 to 12 times more likely to advance to the next stage of trial. We think we can do better by a lot, right? So at each stage, you can think of de-risking the step to the next stage. And if you think about that as a kind of techno-economic model, you can decrease the discount you're putting on the potential, net present value of that molecule. And then in terms of efficacy, again, we think that the history of drug development has showed companies are better off having a predictive biomarker than not. And again, you just have to look to the huge successful drug stories, things like Keytruda, right? This is the #1 checkpoint inhibitor. Tagrisso, you've got all these drugs that became true life-saving medicines and hugely important tools in the physician's armament because we learned how to target them to the right patients to an extent. And I think we can keep doing better, but it's clear that it's a winning strategy, both from a practical, let's get this drug to market, but also from an economic sense. And then again, we want to get these tools in the hands of doctors because we think that's going to make treatment just that much smarter.
Yeah, informed decision making. I looked at your LinkedIn profile and you recently posted about the FDA shift in animal
Mm.
models. Can you update the audience on your perspective on that?
Yeah, so the FDA recently published a roadmap, and keep in mind it's a roadmap, so it's anticipating being multi-years, of phasing out animal models where they're less effective and phasing in patient-derived models. Uh, the roadmaps specified things like organoid models. So an organoid is when you take some tissue from a patient and you grow it up in a laboratory setting, but aiming to create a 3D structure that at least in terms of how it responds to a drug in a dish is going to more closely recapitulate what's happening in the human than just cell lines or again a mouse. So the kind of drug you could imagine struggles to prove anything in a mouse would be a human antibody, right? Human antibodies are designed against human antigens. They're intended to be, not just species specific, but sometimes quite individual specific. And so, mouse models there are extreme workarounds to make mouse models work for these kinds of drugs, but they may not be the most informative. Maybe furthermore, kind of glibly, we've cured cancer in mice a million times. Like even patient-derived xenografts, where you take a bit of patient tissue, stick it in the mouse, and then drug the mouse. Those tend to respond to cancer drugs at a very high rate, way higher than you see in clinical trials, right? So I think the FDA has the right idea, which is we should choose the right model for the drug in the system. I think that everything that's happening at the administration level right now, including at the FDA, is a little bit too blunt axe, right? It's a little too extreme. I don't see us getting rid of mouse models in science. I don't see us getting rid of mouse models in drug development. But I do think there's going to be a greater emphasis on only requiring the models that are truly proved to be predictive or useful for a given question or system. And this should be the case that you choose the right experimental model for what you're trying to ask, right? And so through the journey of drug development, I imagine still using cell lines for certain things, right? Uh, you might use mouse models for other kinds of molecules, small molecules or whatever, but maybe for antibodies or biologics, we have something different. Maybe there really is a true shift to organoids. And then I would posit that artificial intelligence models have a really big role to play here. This wasn't specifically what the FDA was talking about, but the idea that you can train an AI model to truly understand the human disease in a way that you can make predictions that hold up in a clinical setting. Well, we're already doing that. And so I see a future where certain proved AI models, and there's going to have to be a very well-defined burden of proof, right? A burden of, does this work in the clinic? Is it clinically useful? But if you can meet those standards, I think that AI models could absolutely play a front and center role in IND filings, in decision making around getting drugs into the clinic, and so that's a future that I think we're contributing to. In addition to my work at Genialis, I'm a founding member and a board director of an organization called the Alliance for AI in Healthcare. This is a global nonprofit. It's an industry advocacy organization made up of dozens and dozens of corporate members and academic institutes and law firms and individuals who are all united around this vision and this mission of responsible AI, the idea of responsible adoption of AI in healthcare. And so over the last 6+ years as an organization, we've tried to work really closely with the FDA, with the EMA in Europe, with congressional bodies, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, et cetera, to help build the framework for how do we know if an AI is working? Do we have standards for the training data? Do we have standards for how you report the performance metrics? Can we help figure out the right ways to update models or retrain models? Or what if the data is a continuous flow from your Apple Watch? How do you then think about the model getting smarter? These are non-trivial questions, right? And we need policy guidance. We need good regulatory laws. So we've always looked at the regulatory bodies as real partners in this, not as an adversarial barrier to adoption, but rather as the necessary partners to figuring out the right way to get these tools in place. And, so I take, the cup half full view of the FDA's notice the other day is saying they're really open to innovation, and let's make sure we as an industry work to do this as a partnership and not in some sort of exploitive loopholey way.
Yeah, it's an interesting movement. I think the stock market reacted very quickly to this announcement, and if I remember it right, Charles River dropped
Hmm.
a little bit on the mark
Hmm.
on
Oh,
the news.
Charles River dropped a lot, yeah, and like companies like Recursion Pharma, which are
Yeah,
AI native, saw a boost.
but we are
I'm
not. We
not
are,
smart enough to know. I'm not smart enough to play the stock market, and I certainly don't think the stock market is smart enough to tell us the real future. But yeah, it's been pretty reactive. It was, let's put it this way: the FDA announcement came without a lot of preamble, right?
Mhm.
So you see these big market moves when something isn't already priced in. I think Charles River has a very important role to play. It's a very important company. Um, I'm sure that their stocks will rally and their business will succeed. But meanwhile, we see a lot of other companies investing in organoid technologies. And again, a lot of companies like Recursion, which Recursion's been a real trailblazer, building this complete AI stack from tip to tail. But that AI is being trained on data, and they're generating the data on these sort of stage appropriate experimental and human models, right? So coming at it from the base case of super high throughput cell line drug screens and real world evidence from humans in the clinic, and you kind of build the AI all the way and meet in the middle. It's a profoundly different approach. And you can. I also host a podcast. It's called Talking Precision Medicine, and if you go back to our March episode, was an interview with Najat
Mhm.
Khan, who's
Okay.
the chief commercial and strategy officer at Recursion, and we spoke a lot about how Recursion is putting AI in place at every stage of the way, and what that evolution is like. Um, I encourage this audience to go have a listen to that, but it's a different paradigm. I think big pharma is quickly playing catch up, and will also, have similar tooling up and down the value chain.
But we are not fully there yet. I think this is the point from
No.
the FDA announcement. It's a roadmap, and
Hmm.
it won't happen overnight, probably in 5, 10, 15 years. My question to you is, when I think back to my time in drug development, when I entered this space in 2006, I have a business background. And what I saw in preclinics was basically you want to solve three problems: toxicity, safety,
Hmm. Hmm.
efficacy. You want to have data on efficacy and safety, and scaling up the drug ingredient, whatever that is.
Right.
You can deliver it
Right.
for clinical stages. When I looked at the numbers, at the cost in this area, it's pretty expensive with
Yeah.
a very, very little outcome. And when we then went into clinic in the first company, and I talked with the chief medical officer, and asked him,
Hmm.
what do we get? Why do we need to do these toxicity trials and efficacy trials over again? I mean, we already have the models. He said,
Hmm.
these models don't give us any information. I said, why should we do it then? And you
Hmm.
made your statement in your post that you said that some AI models are already outperforming traditional animal models. So my thought back then
Hmm.
was, why can't we automate this process? I mean, if we got so
Hmm.
little information from animal models, why can't we automate that? Will this
Hmm.
ever be a reality?
Again, I think it's there's not a blanket answer, but yes, I do believe that there will be AI models that have been proved to show highly correlative or highly predictive metrics for things like toxicity or dose finding, right? That are going to be used as part of IND filings to get drugs into humans into the clinic that will supersede or obviate the need to go through certain animal models that have not been shown to be predictive, but are done due to old legislation or old habits. This is not going to be true across the board, but it'll be true in some places and for some drugs. Um, if the FDA is smart, and I think that FDA Commissioner McCary is a very smart person. He's dedicated his career to trying to improve patient safety. Um, if we keep patient safety as the watchword for the FDA, then that means we don't want to do things that make drugs more dangerous, but we do want to do things that make them more efficient and maybe even safer, right? I'll give you an example from cancer right now. Right now, kind of the standard in finding a dose for a cancer drug, and you do this through phase 1 studies, is what's called the maximum tolerated dose, MTD, right? The FDA has a program called Project Optimus that's been going for a while. I hope it survives the administration change, where they're trying to think about optimal dose selection rather than maximal dose selection, right? So instead of just shoving as much medicine in as you can without making the patient sicker, can we find the right amount that's actually the biologically effective dose? And our contention, and something Genialis is working on, is we can build AI models that help with that, right? To define a biologically effective dose and what are the right biomarkers that tell you on it for a given patient. Maybe that BED, that biologically effective dose, even varies from patient to patient. So this would be a whole paradigm shift, right? But it would be better for the patients because again, you're giving them less of, medicine. Medicine is just a well-dosed poison, right? You're giving them less of the poison. Likewise with predictive biomarkers, if we can predict who's going to benefit and you get a menu of options of what the drug regime should be for those patients, then you can really boost the therapeutic index, even of drugs that are less well tolerated. And so this is exactly what the kind of stuff we are working on at Genialis. It's can we build these algorithms that solve translational and clinical decision-making problems from everything from toxicity and safety to dose finding, but again, predicting therapeutic outcomes, predicting combos, predicting sequencing so that patients get the best, safest, most efficacious treatments possible. And like I said in my post, some AI models are already outperforming in some ways. We have a poster that'll be presented with a pharma partner at the American Association of Cancer Research Conference in 2 weeks. And it's an early cut of data, so it's, take it with a grain of salt. But in this model that we've built to try to understand, which patients are going to respond to which drugs, we're doing translational analysis. So here we're reanalyzing data from some of their pre-patient models, right? Things like organoids and PDXs. And we are able to predict response in many cases where those models fail. And so I think that the AI models that we're building and a lot of our friends in the industry working on other technologies are building are already there in terms of the capacity to outperform traditional translational models. But where we're behind is we haven't built necessarily the clinical proofs yet, where you can just walk in the door and say, we use this model, it's well known, it's well defined, all the parts are here, the performance metrics are here, this is what it says, therefore we are proceeding with our filing. Building the case of clinical data for any given model or any given device is a long road. It's a road we're on, but the industry as a whole is not there yet.
Yeah. I mean, I have still this dream of fully automated preclinical phase. Will this be possible ever?
Yeah. Well, the person who talks most publicly about that is my friend Alex Jaronko from In Silico Medicine, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
his
that's right.
company is also AI native. They're a drug discovery company, a drug development company now. And he's been investing very heavily in automated robotics labs, in closed loop. Can we identify a novel target, identify a novel chemistry, synthesize the chemistry, run all those tests, and get it all the way to IND as fast and automated as possible. And they've probably done the best job of that of anyone, or at least he's done the best job of marketing his capabilities of doing that. Is it possible to go from, literally novel target discovery to IND or first in human in an automated way? I think Alex would say yes. I don't have hands-on experience, so I'm going to duck the question and say, but I'm not sure.
Simulated and automated within 1 month,
Yeah.
you're at
I,
IND stage. This would be.
yeah. I remain a big believer in human in the loop for a lot of reasons. I think that humans and computers are good at different things, right? I'm not even going to comment on what robots are good at, but humans and computers are good at different things. And I think that part of what appeals to me about science is the artistic side, the creative side. And I think there's still a very big role for human intuition, for the complexity of humans' ability to connect the dots, for kind of the scientific arts to play a role in this. And so I think that maybe that's why I'm skeptical that it'll ever be fully automated, but it's also I'm not sure that it should be. I don't know.
Is it really taking the humans out of the process? I always thought it's more shifting creative work to the humans, but getting them out of repetitive work.
Right. Well, today I would argue that's the case, right? So, I would also argue that's the goal, that the goal of AI across healthcare, whether it's in a drug discovery setting or in a medical practitioner setting or whatever, should be to give humans more time for human things, right? More time between doctors and patients, more time for empathy, more time to ask questions, more time to think deeply about the patient journey and what the right intervention should be. And likewise, on the drug discovery side, more time to design the right experiments, to
Mhm.
choose the models that are truly representative of the question at hand, et cetera. So I think that is what's happening and the goal, but I'm pushing back a little bit on this vision of a fully automated process, because then you have to ask where do the humans fit in the loop, right? I saw this great meme in reaction to sort of the rise of the chat GPTs of the world, right? The LLMs. And it says, like, I don't want an AI bot that's going to make new music and make new art for me so that I have more time to do the dishes.
Yeah,
Give me
yeah.
a robot that's going to wash the dishes so I can go play music and do art, right? And I think that's got to be the right idea.
Dish is a good point. It reminds me of our preparation, and I read in your material that you sent to me that you almost became a marine biologist or a fine dining chef. Can you talk
I've
more
al
about this?
I've almost been a lot of things, sure. So if you look at the books up here, this one is The Professional Chef. That's
Mm,
the textbook from the Culinary Institute of America, where I've never gone to school, but I have eaten. And I've also got up there a book on sea turtles and Texas coral reefs. And yeah, so the bookshelf behind me contains multitudes of lives. I grew up. I mean, my first scientific passion was marine systems. I wouldn't have called it that at age 7. I learned how to snorkel with my uncle, who was a cell biologist in the south coast of France. He worked in a laboratory called uh, uh, Station Zoologique in Villefranche-sur-Mer, and was a biologist of the old guard who did, really impactful, important cell biology and early molecular biology.
mm,
But understood that you had to choose the right model, right? So his model systems for understanding how sperm and egg found each other and how fertilization commenced were organisms like the sea urchin and jellyfish. And there are certain properties of their sperm and egg cells in the biology that made them useful for this. And it turns out a lot of those kinds of discoveries, and you can extend this to C. elegans worms and fruit flies and lots of other organisms, underpin everything we know about biomedicine, right? The human as a model organism is a relatively, new thing in terms of experimental perturbation. Um, so anyway, I learned to snorkel at his lab on holiday when I was 7, and we went back again when I was 10, and we spent a series of summer vacations with my family and my cousins and uncle's family in Woods Hole in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where there's also a marine biological laboratory. And I just love that stuff and figured that's what I do. Um, I ended up in college studying evolutionary biology, still kind of inspired by the idea of being a natural historian and going out into the jungles or into the coral reefs to figure out how natural systems had evolved. And I was starting to think, okay, cool, could we harness some of these systems? Could we find compounds or chemicals synthesized in nature that have interesting effects and based on their evolutionary purpose? Um, but somewhere along the way, and even younger than 7, I remember cooking with my dad my whole life and loved to cook. And um, at some point, the hobby became more of a profession. In college, I would earn money from catering student events, and then I worked in
cool.
some restaurants and was really on the fence. I loved doing both of them a lot. And so I worked in a lab for a while at Yale after college and got a bit bored. And so then I went and worked in a kitchen and back and forth. And then I said, listen, I've got to get off this fence. But before I commit to graduate school, which is a very long commitment, let me go try this cooking thing, because I can walk through that door and walk back out if it's not for me. And it was the most fun I'd ever had. I spent a year in my early 20s cooking at a restaurant that ended up getting 2 Michelin stars in Upper West Side Manhattan.
Cool.
I was just the cook. I
Wow.
wasn't the chef, but it was still learning really great knife skills, learning how to work with a lot of pans. One of my co-cooks there, he would say, if you don't have all 8 burners going, you're wasting your time. I mean, it was intense, right? Um, but I also, I realized that, like, there was a lot of living to do outside of a hot kitchen. And again, thinking of my uncle as an example, he had this great scientific career, but I also remembered on those summer holidays, he would invite all the colleagues from the lab to the house and we'd do a big fancy dinner. And you can have cooking as a hobby as a scientist, but it's very hard to be a cook and have science as a hobby or anything as a hobby. It's
Mm,
an all-consuming profession. So I ended up going back into the lab for graduate school, and I would be lying if I said I've never looked back. I actually think about that decision every day of my life. And I even had an offer the following year after my first year of graduate school to go work as a cook, staffing a private motor yacht in the Mediterranean for the summer. And I mean, I'm 25 years old. Like the idea of going to, spend my summer cooking on a yacht in the Mediterranean, like who says no to that? I said no to that so I could keep doing science. And I think about that choice every day, but it's a long life and I still get to cook. So.
No, it sounds amazing. I mean, you worked in a Michelin star restaurant. This is really great. It's really great.
Well, I have to, I just, this was 20 years ago, and I feel guilty enough that I'm still using that example as like, so, something great I did. But this was before Michelin had come to New York. So I will say we were a Zagat rated 28 or 29, which was the guidebook of reference back then. But shortly after I left the kitchen, Michelin came to the city and the restaurant won its stars. So maybe I can take some credit for that.
Absolutely. What fascinated you in what led you to precision oncology?
I'll be honest, it was a bit opportunistic. I mean, again, my entrance into the entrepreneurial world was being amazed by, being inspired by the technology. And when I say the technology here, part of what I mean is machine learning and artificial
Mhm.
intelligence. I had the good fortune of training alongside some people who I consider some of the most brilliant mathematical minds of our generation. A woman named Marinka Zitnik, who's a faculty at Harvard. I would put my money on her as the most important academic creator of AI for healthcare today, like just in terms of what her lab produces. She had trained with a fellow named Yuri Leskovich at Stanford. They're both Slovenian, by the way. And my direct Slovenian mentor, Blaž Zupan, who's on the faculty at University of Ljubljana, and his students, getting to train with these guys, I fell in love with the tech. Coming out of the lab, I wasn't working in a cancer lab. I was working in more of a basic biology lab, looking at issues of self, non-self recognition and kind of the evolution of the immune system. But I was a molecular biologist, and I was also inspired by the ubiquity of our ability to sequence things, to sequence the genome, to sequence the transcriptome, the proteome, to be able to actually measure all the molecules and then do something with it with the AI. That was so inspirational. But why precision oncology? Well, again, you need to have a market for the thing you're doing. And if you ask, what's the least efficient place to develop drugs? The answer is cancer. And if you say, where is the place where, despite all the investment of time and money to develop new medicines, patients are still failing to thrive? Well, you often will come to cancer again. And so we saw a real opportunity to have an impact, a quick impact on patients, but a big impact on the overall medical ecosystem. At least at the time, 50% of all pharma R&D went into cancer, but like again, just a trickle of drugs came out. What if we could make that much more efficient? Would we be able to make medical prices come down? Maybe, right? So it was kind of this market-based inspiration of where to point the problem. That was 10 years ago. Now in my mid 40s, everybody I know has been impacted by cancer personally, either a parent or a loved one, a sibling, or even themselves. Um, and so the mission has become a lot more human since we've been working on it.
Yeah, that's true. Cancer is a reality, so nobody can deny them over 50. So I know that very well. When you think about cancer, oncology, artificial intelligence, and machine learning,
Mhm.
how challenging was it in your life to unite these two areas in the last 20 years?
I mean, the challenge has been real because, the science is hard to do. All of the science is hard to do. It's hard to build good AI. It's hard to, generate and acquire all the data you need to do the analysis. But I really don't think that Genialis has been working in a vacuum. It's been, a common enterprise, and we have great partners who've contributed a lot. Pharmaceutical companies like Debiopharm in Lausanne, Switzerland, with whom we work closely. Um, they've got an entire portfolio of strategic investments in companies like ours, developing AI and digital technologies to help with cancer diagnostics. And a bit of it's selfish, right? Some of us work with their pharma company to help them develop their drugs, but it's also magnanimous in the sense that they're investing in technologies that'll help humankind. Companies like Tempus AI, with whom we have a collaboration, they're way bigger than us. They've done a much more public job of bringing next-gen sequencing to the masses and
Mhm.
amassing a bolus of data that the rest of the world can now come in and use to build these applications. And that's just two examples, one on the pharma side, one on the diagnostic side, of partners who have also helped move the needle. So yeah, it's hard and we're not there yet, but I also think it's a real community effort. And we each find a giant to stand on the shoulders of and try to move the needle as much as we can.
Let's talk a little bit about deal making and fundraising.
Sure.
You you raised $13 million during the toughest time for fundraising, I guess, 2022 and 2023. How was
Yeah,
that for you?
long. It was hard. I don't think it's unique to Genialis, but we've had what I would call just monumentally bad timing in terms
Mm.
of like when we've got a great idea, when we've got a breakthrough proof point, and we're ready to go to the next phase, the market just seems to conspire against us. So 2021 was a really good year for us. Granted, it was a really good year for a lot of companies in biotech as the market was zooming. But I don't just mean in terms of revenue. I mean technologically, we really solved some hard problems in 21, and we formalized our vision of the supermodel. And we had these proof points with the FDA and with the in the market and with some publications. So it's time to raise money, and then the market collapses, right? So it was 54 weeks from my first pitch in January 2022 to our signature of our, signing the closing documents on the Series A in mid-January 2023, right? That's a long fundraise. And the secret to success there were three, I think. The first one is deep conviction. I knew that we had solved a hard problem, and I knew that if we could get some investment dollars, that we could really blow it out of the water. I, with the work we had been doing with a company called Oncerna, and we developed this proof point around our tumor microenvironment classifier. It worked better than anything else, and I knew that we could scale this technology. So just having that conviction is key, right? And it was a conviction that I had not had in previous fundraising campaigns, where I was a little less certain about our vision. That's one. Two is an incredibly generous network, both of my seed investors and my board members, but also colleagues really opening their networks to me to make introductions to the right investors, right? So that we could, even with our backs against the wall in a tough year, we could be picky and we could be choosy, and we could build the syndicate of smart investors that we wanted, not just money, but smart money. And the third is the culture and the team we had built, right? The company, we had to batten down. We had to survive 54 weeks in a bad market to raise this round. And that meant that everyone on the team had to play their part, paddle in the same direction, and tighten their belts at times. And we did. And we were successful at it. Um, but it wasn't easy, but I would maybe ask, is 2025 a better market to raise money in? I'm not sure. We'll see how long it takes me to get this round together.
Is it ever a good time to raise money?
Yeah, I don't
That's the
know.
question.
Yeah.
You mentioned 53 weeks from the first pitch to the
Something like that,
signature.
53 or 54 weeks. Yeah.
When you count the time in cash on your bank account plus
Yeah.
preparation up to the first pitch, how long was the time?
Yeah. Oh, when we started pitching, we probably had like 3 months of runway.
Oh, really? And you
Yeah.
stretched it
So, I
out?
mean, the trick to flying a plane when you're bolting the wings on is don't hit the ground.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, we're a commercial organization. We kept selling things and making more revenue. We have a brilliant guy running finance who is very good at budget discipline. We figured it out. We kept doing business and kind of being just in time, and we stayed off the ground. Um, but it's never easy.
Yeah, I believe that. I believe that. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you closed a deal with a partnership with Farm. You mentioned it before.
Yeah, so Debbie Farm's a really interesting organization. Again, I think it's an organization with huge foresight and vision, right? They really believe in precision medicine and tool all of the drugs in development that they work on with precision tools. And I think the reason they've got this vision is because their business model is to in-license molecules, either in a preclinical stage or maybe phase one, and they get them through phase two, which is the major piece of risk. And then they, relicense the molecules now that they're de-risked, right? And so if you think about what Debiopharm is trying to succeed at, they're trying to de-risk, new cancer drug candidates to make them medicines. And if you think about what Genialis is trying to do, is we're trying to de-risk new cancer drug candidates to become medicines, right? So mission alignment is really good. And we just take different stabs at it. We're working on the patient classifier models. They're working on the classical drug development approach, and bringing those together is helpful. So DebiaPharm has an innovation fund. They have a venture fund, and which I mentioned earlier has a whole portfolio of really excellent and cutting edge companies working on digital solutions to cancer diagnostics and so forth. Um, so we were able to secure DebiaPharm as a co-lead investor of our Series A. And at the same time, we're negotiating with the pharma side a collaboration around one of their assets, WO0123, which is an inhibitor of WEE1. That's a target in the DNA damage response space, and a very promising target, but a tricky one. But these two transactions are separate. So we earn the investment on the merits of the investment, and we earn the collaboration on the merits of the technology. Now, of course, the two arms of WFarm will speak to each other, right? And in fact, one of the real value adds they give to their portfolio companies is visibility into the pharma side, and you get a board observer from the pharma side, et cetera. But they don't do deals just because one group did it, the other one, not every portfolio company gets a collaboration, and not every company they collaborate with gets an investment. We had to earn both of those separately.
That's good to hear. I think your US president will probably say a deal is a deal. And I can do every deal, and it's pretty much the same, and every deal is easy. But when you look at both, at raising your
Mhm,
Series C, and you have also experience with securing a pharma partner
mhm,
on the business development side, what's the
mhm.
biggest difference between fundraising for a Series A and securing a pharma partner as a strategic partner?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think that in principle, what you're being judged on or is a bit different. Raising a Series A, you have to have some proof points, but the vision is still really big part of what you're pitching, right? You're trying to sell a future where if you get everything right, or even get some of the things right, you're going to change the way business is done. You're going to change the way the world works, and it's going to be monumentally valuable. So I think that at the Series A stage, anyway, you have quite some leeway to sell a big vision. When you're doing a business deal, yeah, you need to align your vision with where the customer is going, but they want to know, how does this help me, right? So one of the biggest pitfalls, I think, in startups trying to do business with big companies is we're constantly trying to sell them our technology,
Mhm.
right? Our technology is so cool. Buy our technology. No one wants to buy technology. People want to buy solutions to their problems, right? So the business development side, it's really the challenge, and it's something I still struggle with every single time I write some piece of marketing collateral. We have to go back a day later and fix it because I wrote about how cool our technology is and not about what is the customer's problem we solve, right? So I think that's maybe the biggest difference is in the case of fundraising, you're really selling a future of a vision of the future that's transformed because of your success. And in the case of a business deal, you're really trying to sell the customer a better version of their future that's transformed because you understand their problems in a unique way. And those are maybe subtle, but big differences.
Yeah, this will make a fantastic 50-second clip, in my opinion.
Good.
Understanding the customer need. I think we
Yeah.
really very often forget this small little
Mm.
but the most important point.
Yeah. And it's embarrassing, we every so often we'll go back and it's like, all right, guys, it's time to update the website. And every time we do it, I'm embarrassed because the previous version was too much about us and not enough about who our audience. And even knowing that, I can guarantee you that when we update the website, which should be in the next couple of weeks, it's still 3 months from now going to feel too much about us and not enough about the customer, right?
Yeah. And I think this is the most important question when you talk to a customer. What do you need? What's your problem?
Yeah,
What problem do you want to
yeah,
solve?
yeah.
Can for the young entrepreneurs in the audience, can you walk us through the debut farm deal, the major steps? How does it work to engage a farmer partner with understanding the need and finally closing the deal? I think
Yeah.
many entrepreneurs dream of that.
Yeah, I'm actually not going to use W Farm as an example, partly because it's very real and hard to abstract, and partly because it was, it was a long set of conversations and my head of business led it. But instead, I'll try to make this more general, and how we engage with pharma customers more generally. So again, our products are these machine learning algorithms that are used as translational and clinical intelligence. They're patient classifiers. And the way that we see the world is, or at least try to, is through the customer lens. A pharma company is developing a drug against a given drug target. The drug has a certain mechanism of action, and that's why it works. So we build products specific to these targets. And I'll give you an example. One of our products is called Genialis KRAS ID. I've already said in this call that KRAS is a major cancer drug target. And there's a whole class of new drugs called KRAS inhibitors, right? So we've built this product for that little sliver of the market. Companies developing drugs against KRAS or other RAS drugs, RAS targets. So here, when we engage with a pharma client, we have several big ones, several big pharma and some biotechs working on with these algorithms. The way we typically start is proof of concept. They need to trust that this algorithm works, right? Why should they believe little old us? So we can do a turnkey evaluation in under a month using whatever translational data they're willing to share to show that the base case algorithm, the thing we've already built that's sitting on the shelf right here, is going to work, to show that it's learned the biology necessary to understand their drug. That's the first thing we do. It takes about a month. Then we work with them to design a proper proof of concept study. What do we need to show you over maybe 3 months of work to prove that this is something you need in the clinic, to get to that point of conviction, to adopt this as a tool for clinical decision making? And typically, these will be retrospective studies where first we'll retrain the model to be more compound specific, and then run retrospective studies on either mouse trial data or first in human phase 1 data, or it can be flexible, right? We're quite flexible. But the goal is the same, is to get them to a point of conviction that this is a tool they can't live without. And then the next phase of the collaboration is to commit to this co-development of the algorithms to support clinical decision making. And here they can license access to the algorithm. We have a whole technology suite that comes with it, and we'll provide the AI-enabled and expert services to make sure the model is tailored to their drug, to make it compound specific, to give them a competitive advantage through clinical development. So that's typically how a pharma collaboration will progress. Now, what I'll say is that every pharma we work with has a different process of engagement in terms of where contracting and procurement sits, who the champions are, who the budget holders are, et cetera. So it's hard to say there's a push button way to do this. But to your point earlier, Christian, the key is when you get to meet with those customers or those potential customers, you should do more listening than you do talking. You should do more asking questions of, what are the things you're struggling with? Here's my favorite question. If I gave you a crystal ball and you could look in and find the answer to any of your questions about your drug, what would those questions be? Right? And that's what we're trying to give people. It's not magic like a crystal ball. It's AI, it's science. But if you had a crystal ball to uncover anything about your drug, what's the first thing you'd ask? And what's the second? And what's the third? And that makes our collaboration roadmap.
Why why is this so important in making a deal with an industrial partner to ask a lot of questions instead of this human notion to start talking and presenting and try to
Mhm.
persuade and try to talk them into buying it? Why is asking questions the better way?
Um, there are kind of two answers, right? So when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're going around just saying like, let me hit this, like, you're going to end up bruising some thumbs. It's partly because not only does every pharma company do deals differently, every pharma company develops drugs differently. There are real scientific cultures that are specific to organizations. And it is presumptuous of us to assume that this tool we've built is the thing you're looking for us to think that we understand your pain. It gets back to
Mhm.
empathy, right? You know, you need to listen, and you need to ask not just the first question, but the second and third order questions to really appreciate what someone's going through, whether that's an emotional turmoil or why is developing this drug more challenging than that. And even two companies that are developing competing drugs against the same target may have very different challenges, right? One might be dealing more with a toxicity issue, whereas one might be dealing with a selectivity issue, for example, right?
Mhm.
And I would contend that our system of AI that Genialis has built, our supermodel, can help address all of these questions. But we need to ask the right question, right? We need to make sure that we're addressing the question that's most urgent, most painful, most valuable to solve today, and then we can move to the next one, or we can do them in parallel. But we first need to write, to ask the questions and write them down.
So it takes a little bit of patience
Yeah.
signing a pharma deal. I can imagine
Hmm.
that. I mean, the fast way, the ideal way for many people probably would be, uh, here's my tool. It's the best. You need it. Buy it, pay, we are done.
Yeah.
How long does it take to secure a pharma partner time-wise when we talk about patients?
So so the canonical industry average is like 18 months
Hmm.
for an enterprise deal with a pharma company. And a lot can happen in 18 months. Here are some of the things that can happen. The drug program that you're trying to work on can get canceled, right? Or be sold. The champion you've cultivated at the pharma partner that wants to use your product can retire, get fired, or change jobs, right? The whole team can be reorganized. We had a great call last year with the KRAS team at a big pharma. We're super eager to get started. And then they went completely silent for 3 months. And when we finally got one of them to respond to an email, he confided to us that every single person on that call had a new job and none of them were working on that molecule anymore.
Mm.
This happens, right? So 18 months is the canonical sales cycle. We have right now just signed a pilot agreement with a top pharma. We've just completed a pilot agreement or a pilot project with another top pharma. And we have an ongoing project with a mid-size biotech, all for one of our products, right? Same set of algorithms for different pharma and a few others in the works. And we met all of them about 11 months ago,
Mhm.
and it took the quickest of those was 5 months to kick off, and the longest was 11 months to kick off. Um, and I think that's quite fast. And it's quite fast because we have a very well-defined product that again can be aligned with a bunch of different problems or needs. Um, and that's just for one of our products. And we have a bunch of other products, but I'm using this as a kind of trying to make a generalizable example.
Rafael, you mentioned that you needed 53 weeks to secure funding for your company,
Hmm.
18 months, the canonical time until closing a pharma deal. It takes a lot of patience. Before you talked about the
Hmm.
hustle culture in Silicon Valley, and I also believe you have sort of hustle culture in your company where you push things forward and make things
Hmm.
happen internally. Where did you learn patience in dealing with pharma clients then? What's your secret?
Um, I don't know that I have patience in dealing with pharmacology. I'm going to challenge the premise here. I'm not sure that I have patience. Where did I learn patience? Think of it a little bit differently. So, and one thing about Genialis is I don't think we have a hustle culture per se. I think we have uh, it's a bit of a work hard, play hard culture, but it's a very balanced culture. We have the ability to see the long game, and this is what's important. Working 80 hours, 100 hours a week is nonsense, in my opinion. Sometimes, okay, sometimes there's a sprint, you have a deadline, you can't help it. We have a program in our company called Flex Fridays. We don't schedule internal meetings on Fridays. You're encouraged to not schedule any meetings on Fridays. You're encouraged to do deep work on whatever you want to work on. And there's a lot of research now showing that 4-day work weeks are more productive than 5-day work weeks. There's a lot of research. I'm thinking here of like Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, showing that giving your employees not only permission, but encouraging them to find large stretches in their calendar where they're not disturbed and allowing them to use that time for whatever problems they're trying to solve gets you to the solution. And here's the other thing. I don't care if my employees use their Fridays to come to the office to do deep work, to stay at home to do deep work, or if they decide that they need to go climb a mountain or run a marathon that day in order to clear their head and think through something. We've got a team of scientists, and in my experience, biologists have a huge stack of papers on their desk, and they're just waiting for a long flight so they can actually have time to read. And computer programmers have a huge pile of new computer code libraries or new tools that they're trying to find time to try out, but they just don't have time. If you give people a day where you say, go do what you need to do, I don't care what you do, do what you need to do, you end up way more productive. And this is something we put in place 2 years ago, and it turns out it works like a charm. It's not a day off, it's a day to maximize your well-being and your efficiency, however you see fit. So this is not a direct answer of how did we learn patience, but I think that part of the Genialis culture is to be very process oriented, right? Yes, we have goals. We have a quarterly OKR system for quarterly goal planning. We have, weekly tasks. We have 3-year strategy. Like we set goals. We run hard at stuff. but we also know that we've got a 10-year vision, right? And, you know, that keeping some perspective on how long this takes is important. I think this is shown through my career, my adventures underwater, my adventures in kitchens, my adventures in molecular biology, and transitioning to running a business. None of this was intentional. It's not like I set a goal for myself. By the time I'm 45, I want to be running this company and doing this thing. If you figure out a process, if you figure out a journey that's rewarding, if you find that balance where you can be really productive at work, you can have impactful, meaningful work, but have time for your family, time for your friends, encourage hobbies, um, then the patience comes.
You mentioned in the preparation material, it's all about the journey over the destination. Where did this mindset come from?
Well, no, I just, I enjoy doing stuff. I enjoy learning. I think you know, maybe it comes from, if you're not super goal oriented, it's harder to be disappointed, right? But part of that is just like, genuinely enjoying the process. I think it's very much related to taking so much joy from learning things, right? When you get to the end of something, what fun is that, right? So I love the title of your podcast. So remind the audience what this is called, right?
Mhm.
This series, right?
Beginner's Mind
The
podcast.
beginner's mind. Yeah. So my wife and I have a challenge to each other. Every year we try to come up with something for each of us. We come up with something that we're going to be a beginner at, something
Mhm.
totally new that we suck at, that we're going to try. And we're going to try to learn and we're going to enjoy doing it. I've got a ton of hobbies that I really stink at. But man, being a beginner is so much fun, right?
That's true. That's true. You run a company, and the companies very often are about focus on one thing and
Hmm.
become the best in this area. And then you
Hmm.
contradict it in your private life and say, no, I want to be a beginner in many things, and I'm
Hmm.
multidisciplinary. What's the benefit of this multidisciplinary approach in a focused business world?
Yeah. I think that if Genialis has one real Achilles heel, it's that we're not great at focus, and that's probably my fault, right? We do try to do a lot of things. But the way that I excuse it, the way that I kind of make it okay is we do have a very clearly articulated vision, right?
Mhm.
We went through a strategy setting exercise just before closing the Series A, so in December of 2022, where we drafted a 3-year strategic roadmap with quite some detail. And I go back and look at that every quarter as we set our quarterly goals. And sure enough, we're right on track, right? So we've had a North Star, we've had a plan. But as it turns out, this field is so damn complicated that all these things that might feel like distractions or side quests turn out to be, and maybe this is not by accident, essential learnings, essential pieces of the puzzle, right? We need to get really good at this thing in order to support this other thing. And maybe it wasn't obvious at first, but there was a reason why we were doing it. So, having that kind of North Star, that clearly articulated vision, aligning with the company, we have all hands strategy retreats every 6 months, the whole team together, the leadership team first, and then the whole team. These are crucial points in time where we make sure everyone remembers how their piece rolls up into the next piece and how the functional teams roll up into the whole. And that's not to say we're trying not to. We try to be nimble. We react to realities on the ground. We react to changes, but we think we know where we're going.
You mentioned side quests. I mean, this happens very often in companies that new things pop up,
Hmm.
and some might distract from the mission, others might benefit the mission. What's your decision-making criteria? How do you decide what's important for your mission and what not?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everyone, there's resource constraints on everyone, right? And venture-backed startups are case studies in resource constraints. You're constrained in money, you're constrained in time, you're constrained in effort, right? So we have any number of ways. So some are very empirical and granular when we think about software development, right? Building the tools. We have a scoring system that determines how much effort something's going to take and how much impact it's going to have and so forth. So it's straight out of a product management playbook to come up with a way of prioritizing what we work on based on this score, where the numerator is the impact and the denominator is the effort, right? You're trying
Mhm.
to, maximize this ratio. Um, all the way up to much more amorphous things like crap, that's a cool new publication technology. Can we poke at that and see if it's useful? One of the really big successes in the last year for us has been building an internship program where we run a lot of the more far-fetched ideas. We hand the side quests off to young talent with the right amount of supervision, but without too much investment that it drains our resources. And we've actually made some really great breakthroughs through this program where we say, that's got promise. And all right, let's pull it into the actual R&D team now and make it work. But we don't have a hard and fast, decision tree. But it does take discipline. Some of it is just, having the right conversations with the right people, both at the C-suite level and the managerial level, and even at the ground level to get feedback. Like, is this working? Is it worth it? When do we decide to cut bait, or when do we decide to double down? There's some art here in addition to the science.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. This is the tension between focus and innovation. No innovation and the focus doesn't matter. On the other hand, just innovation and just being distracted and multidisciplinary doesn't lead anywhere either.
Yeah,
Finding the right balance is key to success in the end of the day.
absolutely.
Yeah. I see that the time flies when you have fun, and it's really great talking to you. But I just checked the clock, and we are 10
Oh
minutes
man.
before the 2 hour mark. What would you like to focus on in the last part of our conversation?
Well, first of all, if you're still watching the live stream and you're not my mom, send me a note. I want to know who you are that you found this so exciting. We can have a call. What do I want to focus on? I mean, you tell me, you know your listenership better. What do you think would be most interesting to double down on or bring up at this point in the conversation?
Future predictions. I really like
Okay.
at the end of the conversation
Yeah.
to look into the crystal ball and think about how the future looks like.
Yeah. Future predictions. So I firmly believe that medicine will continue to become more precise. And it's going to happen in a lot of ways. The actual design of molecules will be informed by human biology in ways that the medicines themselves are more precise. For some kinds of medicines, I think we're going to be able to take a readout from a patient and make an N of one medicine for that patient, right? These are, things like cell and gene therapies that are really tailored to those patients. And then more generally, I think we're going to have an armament of off-the-shelf medicines with the tools to direct them to the right people. So I really do believe that all of medicine will be precision medicine, not just in cancer, but in every aspect of medicine. I think it's inevitable that artificial intelligence is going to be in everything we do. I am honestly surprised at how fast that's changed, right?
Mhm.
Because it was slow and it was slow and it was slow, and people were like, yeah, right, artificial intelligence, nice buzzword. And then all of a sudden it's literally flipping everywhere, right? There was this inflection point with, I think, the OpenAI sort of uh, movement into the public domain. So granted that I think it's going to be everywhere, I think you're going to see a lot of consolidation, right? So some big players harnessing some of the tools. I think you're going to see, um, the things that work rising up and a lot of the stuff that doesn't falling by the wayside, but a lot of experimentation. We're not going to know what works at first. And my hope is that the stuff that really helps improve healthcare, improve well-being, well care, and sick care. Those are two different things, right? Improve people to live, help them live healthy lives, help them detect disease early, help them find the right treatments. This is going to be very much a human-computer partnership going forward.
When we think about the next 10 years and assume that your company is wildly successful in the industry and everything that you are working on really works out well and changes the healthcare industry, how does the industry look like after 10
Yeah.
years?
Yeah. If Genialis does our job right and our collaborators, make the contributions we expect, every single cancer drug is going to have a suite of algorithms that tell you um, how safe is this molecule? How much should you give and who should you give it to? Every single cancer drug. And I think we can use the learnings from drugs that are in development and drugs that are in the market to help us find the next best targets, right? So new targets and new chemistry to save lives. So I really think that we're going to be part of the glue that takes this long road of drug development from target discovery and compound discovery to patients on market and makes it from one straight line to a circle, right? We want to close the loop between the human experience and the discovery of the next generation of medicine, and make all of that as precise and efficacious and efficient as possible.
But does it mean that artificial intelligence in drug development, you said every drug will have a suite of AI tools connected to it?
Mhm.
Then AI is not so much a tool, it's more a companion to the drug at the end of the day. So it evolves with the drug.
I think that's right. I think every drug is going to have kind of an information companion
Mhm.
that helps it on its journey to move faster, right? Again, already in silico medicine has a proof of concept where they moved a drug from, they claim, from target discovery and compound design to first in human in 18 months. That's lightning fast.
Yeah.
Now, the question is that drug going to work better? And we're waiting to see the readout, right? But imagine that's going to speed up even more. Imagine every investigational drug could get to a decision point, an IND decision point in 12 months, right? And
Mhm.
then now imagine that they're actually better, and they're better either because they're designed better or against better targets, or going to be all the above because they've got algorithms that help dose them properly and help find the right patient groups. This could be huge. It could be 12 months of preclinical, and can we shrink clinical development to a 4 or 5 year process with an 75% success rate? That's a different world.
Yeah, well, I hope it works out in that way. More precision in the drug development process, faster timelines, and better drugs faster on the market
Yeah,
at a cheaper
yeah,
price.
all of that. Yeah.
I think it's possible. I mean, 20 years ago, when I thought about the heart problem, I always learned in commercial school, you either can push the price down or the quality
Hmm.
up. Both at the same time is not possible. And then we had these outlier companies like Apple, Amazon, Microsoft,
Hmm.
Tesla. They really cracked everything on all ends. So why not drug development?
Hmm.
We are still lagging behind in that area.
Hmm. I think it's because the failures take so long and cost so much that the successes have to cover those costs,
Mm.
right? So again, if we can make it faster, make them better so there's less failure, then I think you can have, a better product for cheaper.
What's the biggest bottleneck that you see in the industry currently that holds us back to achieve this goal?
In my opinion, it's a misalignment at the payer level. I think that we are still penny wise, pound foolish in so many cases, but here I'll speak mostly about the US healthcare system. It takes a huge lift to get reimbursement for a diagnostic test. When we know if that test works, it's going to save you a lot of time and money on the healthcare side. But a lot of the paradigm is, or insurance will pay for an expensive drug that may or may not work, but not for a relatively cheap test that'll let you know. So the piece that I'd love to see change is a dramatic simplification of the way healthcare is paid for, especially in the US, and a real appetite, top-down appetite from payers and providers to see outcomes as the key driver of how we do things, right? We need to deliver healthcare value. We need to deliver outcomes, not just activities.
Yeah, that's important. Rafael, at the end of the call, what's one big ask for the audience? What are you looking for with your company?
One big ask, I'll give you three. We are
Go ahead.
always we are always looking for pharma to collaborate with. So if you've been listening or if you tune in and you're developing new medicines, even if it's not in oncology, I'd love to have a conversation about how we could team up and do a better job. If you are an investor in the space and you share our vision and find our track record compelling, we're always raising money, but we're actively raising money now. I'd love to have a conversation. And if this is the kind of organization you think you'd like to work with or work for, get in touch. We're actually not hiring today, but we're always recruiting. We're always building relationships because at the end of the day, when we do add to the team, it's about culture fit. It's about values matching. And so we want to get to know you. Reach out. I'm especially responsive on LinkedIn. You can leave some comments in the show when we post the show. I'd love to have a conversation.
So LinkedIn is the best way to connect with you.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
Yeah.
Looking back at the conversation, what's the biggest message you hope sticks with the audience after today, after listening to the episode?
Oh gosh. This is changing the face of medicine. It's a long road, and it's a very heavy boulder to push up that hill. So let's do it together. I think that if we all, can find that kind of patience and enjoyment in the journey, it's going to make it a lot more bearable to do it together.
Rafael, thank you very much for this fantastic conversation. I enjoyed every single minute of these 2 hours.
Thank you, Christian.
And I think the most important message for me was that we really should work hard on making the drug development process more efficient for the betterment of the patient and the world at the end of the day. Less sick patients means a better society and less pain for families.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Rafael, I wish you a happy rest of the week and let's stay in touch.
Thank you, Christian. This was a real pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for being on the show. Have a great day. Bye.
Take care.
Precision doesn't just belong in labs, it belongs in how we treat people. Today, Rafael Rosengarten took us deep into the heart of biotech's next leap, where RNA, artificial intelligence, and empathy converge. We explored a world where every drug has an information companion and every patient gets the treatment that fits them. Healthcare still wastes billions in drugs that fail, not because the science isn't there, but because the systems aren't ready. Raphael's message is clear: ask better questions, build with purpose, solve real problems, not just technical puzzles. If this conversation shifted how you think, don't let it stop at you. Follow the show, leave a review, share it with someone who still believes medicine should be personal, data driven, and human at its core. Every follow, every share brings this vision to more minds. It brings in guests like Raphael, deepens the conversation, and helps us build a community committed to reshaping medicine, not just improving it. The future of medicine isn't cold or mechanical. It's thoughtful, it's tailored, it's collaborative, and it starts with people like you, curious enough to listen, bold enough to act. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and hit subscribe.